So we are now in week 5, and this recording is going to be about Marxism. This is a pretty important concept, and it's going to set up a lot of the things that we talk about in the next few weeks. So take some time with this chapter. I didn't give you any extra reading aside from this chapter this week, so I'm hoping you'll go through it slowly, and I would sort of say almost like paragraph by paragraph, read a paragraph, and then stop and sort of pause and think, okay, do I understand what she's saying here? Could I explain it to somebody else? Great, then go on to the next paragraph, okay? To help you with that, I'm going to go through a few pieces of it right now. So when you start at the beginning of the chapter, she's talking about Karl Marx and Engels and the Communist Manifesto. It's a hugely important piece of work. When I was in college, we had to read the whole thing. So I would encourage you to read it if you're at all interested in economics, basically, and how it connects to literature. So their worldview, communism, was based on the idea that common ownership would create a classless society in which everyone is equal. And now, for Marx and Engels, history was a series of class struggles, and the aim of communism was to push the struggle towards a conclusion in which the violent uprising of the working classes, known as the proletariat, would overthrow the aristocracy and the middle class, the bourgeoisie, and lead to a leveling of economic differences, as the wealth of those with more would be equally distributed to abolish economic difference. So I want to pause there and ask you to think a little bit about how this plays out in America. It's not the same as the way it is in the UK. When if you're working class in the UK, I think in general, I think this is kind of a gross generalization, but in general, there is more sort of class pride in that, and less of a, there's sort of a saying in America that, anyone can kind of like climb up. There's a sort of idea of social mobility, and it can be, I don't know, a little bit of illusion, right? We talk about the American dream of prosperity for everybody, but you've got to be careful because not everyone has equal access to the American dream. It isn't as easy as you might think to climb that ladder. And but because Americans can be so invested in it, it means that we're often really resistant to things that talk about restructuring. So, for example, I read a Time magazine survey of high school students in New York, and these were just in the general public high schools, and they asked how many of them expected to be millionaires, and 70% of them thought that they were going to be millionaires when they were adults. This is not true, right? Like, that doesn't actually happen. And the fact that they thought that is sort of a good indicator of where we can go badly awry. If you assume you're going to be a millionaire, then it means you're going to make decisions about who you vote for, who you support, what kind of policies are important to you based on like, oh, I'll be a millionaire, so my kids will be able to go to college. That will be easy for me. Well, then maybe you're not going to vote for the guy who wants college to be free. Okay? So that's just sort of one example of that. And I don't know to what extent you're familiar with the way things work in other countries, but here in America, we get a lot of people who are very resistant to the idea of paying more in taxes, right? There's this sort of sense of, well, I earn the money, therefore I should get to decide how to spend it. And that's fine, except that it means that you don't get to pool the money together to do more efficient things. So we have done some communist kinds of moves already, or really I'd say socialist kinds of moves. So for example, in the early days of America, there were no fire departments, right? There were private companies that you could, if you were wealthy, you could pay them. And if a fire broke out at your house, they would come and put out your fire. If your neighbor didn't pay them, then when the fire broke out, there was nobody to come and put out that fire, right? And at some point, people realized that fire is dangerous. puts it out, there's a good chance mine will catch fire too. That's essentially the argument for socialism overall, right? It's the idea that when my neighbors are doing poorly, it's likely to affect me. When my neighbors are doing well, it's likely to make my life better, right? Um, so it means, and this plays out in all different kinds of ways. And it's also this idea that, from an economic standpoint, you get better efficiencies if you're not all paying individually. So, if everyone has to pay for a private tutor for their kids, that's going to be more expensive per person than if everyone sends their kids to public school and we put our money together in taxes to pay for the schools. If everyone here in Oak Park, we're now talking about, internet. If everyone pays for their internet individually, that costs a fair bit. If the whole village could kind of get together and say we want to buy community internet from ComEd or not ComEd, Comcast, AT&T, whomever, we can probably negotiate a lower rate for everybody. And it would then be paid out of your property taxes instead of a bill. And that's also more fair because property taxes are connected to how wealthy you are, right? So there's something called regressive taxation is taxation that hits poor people harder than rich people. So to give you an example, something like, I'm trying to think, at the library, if the library has fines, let's say there's a $25 fine on this book that you were late returning. Well, if you make $200 a week or even $500 a week, that $25 is pretty significant to you. If you make $5,000 a week, and I know doctors who do that, then you're not even going to notice that, right? So the American Library Association recommended that libraries that could afford to go ahead and get rid of fines because they were a regressive form of taxation and they hit poor people harder. If the library needed more money, ideally they would get it through property taxes, which would be gradated. So if you buy $1 million house, you're going to pay more in property taxes than if you are renting a 2-bedroom apartment. In fact, you won't pay property taxes if you're renting. Let's say you own a 2-bedroom condo. If you're a renter, you do end up paying some of the property tax costs because it gets passed along to you in the form of rent. It's just a little harder to break out. So I hope some of this is helpful to you. When you think about the world, you'll see that there's lots of gradations. There are places that have almost no social services. But when we look at, say, the Norwegian countries or Australia, the UK, Canada, you'll see more socialist-leaning countries where people have decided to pool together their funds to do things like, in Australia, they have free healthcare for everybody, free school going through college, free, I think probably some grad school too, free care, education. There's another big one I'm forgetting. I'm blanking on what it is right now. But if you can kind of think about, yes, they do pay more in taxes as a result, but they end up overall saving money. And if you can kind of imagine, like if you and your family didn't ever have to pay for healthcare, and if you and your family didn't ever have to pay for education, how much of a difference that would make in your day-to-day life. So it's not really free. When we say free healthcare, it's not actually free. What it means is it's getting distributed across the pool, and everything becomes more even. Okay, so that was the sort of Marxist dream. In actuality, you're going to undoubtedly hear criticism that says, well, communism failed in China, communism failed in Russia, and I think that's a big complicated subject that's getting beyond lit theory stuff. But I would say there are, like, strong communism can be pretty difficult for people in a variety of ways, and there's sort of like this far ideal, and then there's like what practically works. And I think looking to someplace like Canada is probably a better roadmap for us than Sanders is very much what's called a democratic socialist. The people who were agitating after the financial crisis, using terms like the 1%, all of society is kind of set up for the 1% wealthiest. Why is that? We should change that. In current politics, I would say Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is a sort of inheritor of the Bernie Sanders type of philosophy, and Elizabeth Warren ran on a similar platform. I would say generally the Democrats are to some extent incorporating this kind of idea into what they're arguing for. Sanders was in fact, not Sanders, Warren was just appointed to the Finance Committee, and she is now pushing a wealth tax, which is a tax on the wealthiest people that's just a flat tax. So if you have, $1 billion, maybe you should give the government a little more money so that they can get the vaccines rolled out faster, for example, right? Okay. That was a bunch. I hope it's helpful for you. That's kind of like the background thinking. And then I'm going to just go through a couple of points out of this. I think this base and superstructure idea is useful when you're thinking about lit crit, right? Base is the material means of production. Superstructure is the cultural work surrounding it. Lit, philosophy, religion, and law. And Marxists would say there's a strong connection between base and superstructure. So the cultural world is determined by the economic base. At the center of all artistic expression, driving its nature and purpose is the economic system. Marxists call this economic determinism. Okay, so I would say this is, for all of these theories, I would say they come up with something, the theorists tend to be kind of like hard and fast, like this is how it works. And in actuality, it works like this a lot of the time. If it's a good theory, maybe not all the time. And reality is probably, 25 different mechanisms kind of pushing against each other. So I'm not sure I'd say that the center of all artistic expression is the economic system. However, I would say it's a major factor. It really is. Okay, so, and then she says critical theory has its basis in Marxist thought. Okay, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. I'm just going to read out loud this quote from Karl Marx from Das Kapital. Within the capitalist system, all methods for raising the social productiveness of labor are brought about at the cost of the individual laborer. So, for example, when we move to factories, right, and factories make it easier and faster to produce widgets, gears for cars, or whatever it is that you're trying to make. But something is lost in that move. The factory does better, more money comes in. The money goes generally to the owner of the factory primarily. It mostly doesn't get passed down to the worker. And the worker usually loses some autonomy. They get a lot less say in what they do. There's often a lot less variation in their jobs. The job gets more boring. And the conditions often get worse. If you think about garment workers in Bangladesh and like the factory fires there, there's the kind of toxic stuff that people breathe in a variety of factories. I just saw an article this morning talking about how the pandemic, some of the people who are most likely to die from the pandemic are line workers at restaurants. And that's another example, like this idea of like working the line. Here we are, shoulder to shoulder to shoulder, and one person does the same thing over and over again, and that's fast and efficient. But it's a very constrained environment without a lot of freedom to do things like socially distance, get fresh air regularly, etc. Right? So that's kind of it's yes, the company makes more money, but at the cost of the worker, right? Read another line. All means for the development of production transform themselves into means of domination over and exploitation of the producers. So he's saying that in order to have the factory work better and make more money, it has to be more controlling of the people working there, right, and more dominating. And I think of an example like when I was first working after college, I did a lot of secretarial work, and I had to do timesheets, right? And I would clock in and clock out. And if you were late, trouble, right? You might get yelled at the first time or two, and then if you were late too many times, maybe you get threatened with firing. We don't do that to doctors. We don't do that to lawyers. People who are self-employed don't have to live under that threat of like, oh, if I'm not like there on the clock at the dot, I might get fired, right? And so it's a function of buying into that kind of exploitative system. Okay. They mutilate the laborer into a fragment of a man, degrade him to the level of an appendage of a machine, destroy every remnant of charm in his work, and turn it into a hated toil. So again, let's say you're a knitter, right? And previously you would have knit at home with your family. Maybe your kids do the spinning for you. You knit that up into cloth or you weave, and then your husband might take that to market and sell the products of it. And you can imagine, not that I would necessarily want to work with my family, but you can imagine there's a lot of flex there. There's a lot of autonomy. The kids get into a fight. You can take a pause in your work and go and like sort that out, right? You can decide it's breakfast for dinner day. You have some flex, and once you get moved into the factory setting, suddenly all of your choices get taken away from you. That's a lot of what Marx and Nicola were kind of looking at, is what happened in those factory settings, right? Where the factory might well value the machine. Here's this big machine that stamps out the gears for the car, and it cost us $50,000 to buy it. That machine is worth more to them than the 10 people who run it, who are getting paid much less, right? And if it's a choice between, oiling the machine and letting those people take an extra 5-minute break, they're going to go for oiling the machine, so it works better. Okay, so that's kind of like hopefully that's helpful. And then this phrase, the next phrase, they estrange from him the intellectual potentialities of the labor process in the same proportion as science is incorporated in it as an independent power. So that's we're starting to get into kind of academic language here, but I think it's helpful. So when you're estranged from something, it's no longer innate, it's no longer part of you, it's getting pushed away, it's made strange to you. So the intellectual potentialities, the chance you have as a worker to think about your work and make good decisions about it, and say like, oh, I think this would be better if we use 3 threads instead of 5 in this thing. All those choices are getting taken away as the factory kind of standardizes and applies science to create efficiency standards, right? So they distort the conditions under which he works, subject him during the labor process to a despotism the more hateful for its meanness. They transform his lifetime into working time and drag his wife and child beneath the wheels of the juggernaut of capital. So Marx is, he was a rhetorician. He definitely wanted you to feel the misery of, you're being pulled into this factory work, you're forced to it, and you are not only are you going to be destroyed, but your family will also be destroyed in the process, because your pay will go down and you'll be forced to work longer hours, and you're not going to get very much say over it. Okay, so there's a little analysis of that piece, and then I'm going to just hit a couple more things. Ideology is a really important idea. So ideology is the ideas in society serve as a foundation for people's opinions, which contribute to political activity. The next bit is the bit I would really point to. The dominant ideology is that held by those in power or by the majority in society. We are all shaped by the dominant ideologies of our time, okay? Marxists would say that ideology is a set of ideas held by the elite, which they use power to maintain. I would say that's true to some extent, right? The elite definitely have a lot of power and can push their ideas. I think there's also power in the ideas of the non-elite, and there are ways in which those can make it into the consciousness of the people, and I'd say art is actually a huge part of that. So, but Marx would say, because the elite use power to maintain their ideologies, that keeps them in a position of economic dominance. The people who have money continue to have money. Ideology is presented by the state as natural. So that's really important. In general, we are not going to be aware of ideology. A way to think about it is, if you're a fish swimming in water, you don't notice the water. It's like the air you breathe, right? It's all around you. So the ideologies that shape us, we're not used to thinking about. We're not used to making them explicit. They're things we take for granted. So something like, oh, my taxes are too high. That's an American kind of ideology, and Canadians would probably think about it differently. They might say, I'm happy to pay higher taxes than Americans because I have an incredible healthcare system and I never have to worry that if I get sick, I'm going to bankrupt my family, right? So they're buying into a different ideology there. And then there's this bit, even if we think we're resisting ideology, we're not. And I'm not sure I entirely agree. Like, yes, that's possible. It's possible to be within this way of thinking, think you're resisting it, and you're not actually, because it's done such a good job of incorporating your resistance. But I also think it's possible to actually resist. Okay, so this is all Althusser, right? Louis Althusser, and so he extends this Marxist idea to look at how these ideas are reproduced, how ideologies are reproduced. And we're now getting a little bit geeky into all of this stuff, but if it interests you, this may be helpful. He talks about two different kinds of structures, societal structures, that influence how ideologies are reproduced. So one kind are the repressive structures. Such as the police, law courts, and the military, which enforce rule either through violence or coercion, the threat of violence. And, you can think about things like, cops pulling you over for a broken taillight, right? As a sort of state apparatus, they're part of that structure. And they are, if the state has an interest in, for example, continuing to exploit Black people and treat them badly, well, Black people are then going to get pulled over a lot more often than white people are, right? So that's I think those people who are kind of calling for the abolition of the police, which I wouldn't necessarily do that myself, but why they're concerned about it and why they might be calling for it is because they point to just how badly these ideals have been corrupted, how racist, sexist, etc. a lot of these larger repressive structures are. And they say, some people would say, like, it's almost impossible to reform them. We kind of have to burn it all down and start over. I'm not much of a burn it all down person myself, but I see where they're coming from. And it's certainly going to be very hard to reform things when, for example, like when you have a drug that is mostly used by white people, it has a much lower jail time associated with it than a drug that's mostly used by Black people, right? That's the kind of ways in which the whole system it reflects the ideologies of society, and Marx would say the ideology of the people who already have power, right? And it's going to keep trying to reproduce that and reinforce that, so that the people who have power and money continue to have power and money. He also talks about so there's the repressive structures, and then there's the ideological state apparatuses, which don't have a threat of violence, but do offer fear of being socially rejected or ridiculed. So this includes schools, like your state university that I teach in, religious institutions, and family, right? So we have a powerful need to belong as human beings, super important, going back to like the tribe, and so ideology speaks to the individual, gives them recognition, what Althusser calls interpellation, and we can think of it in terms of a school teacher calling us by name or receiving a blessing in a religious ceremony. These activities recognize us as individuals there's a powerful social force that makes people want to go along with whatever the prevailing winds are. If you research politics, you'll find that most people choose their political party based on the people around them. If their parents were Democrats, they're probably going to be Democrats. If their parents were Republicans, they're probably going to be Republicans. If their neighborhood, as they get older, maybe they'll change, but if they live in a neighborhood that is mostly Democrat, they're less likely to switch to Republican and vice versa, right? So if you have a local sports team that you're invested in, you're invested in it because the people around you are invested in it, right? Because this is your team, your city, your town, your school, etc. And that need to belong is very strong. Okay, so that's one way to think about these big, powerful forces. And so he's talking about it. It's not being necessarily something you're forced to, but something you consent to, something you agree. And I think this is probably the last concept I'm going to spend a little time on here. I think it's really important, is this Marxist concept of hegemony that was developed by Antonio Gramsci. So hegemony is this idea that the state controls its population through coercion rather than violence, through the operation of religion, the family, education, and culture. In hegemony, people are often not aware they're being controlled, rather they are manipulated by the social structures they're a part of. State control through coercion rather than force. And so I think that's absolutely true. There are these hegemonic structures that exist around us all the time. Schools, the prison system, your church, and not just the church itself, but the larger religious structure that it's in. The family, right? All of these are powerful structures that are very good at reproducing themselves, and it's really difficult to intervene and get them to change the way they are, right? And even if the way they are is violent and abusive and exploitative and unfair. So, okay, so those are like the big concepts. If you want to know more about hegemony, I love a couple of books by Foucault, who is a sort of follower of Gramsci's, and what he does is he takes the concept and then he plays it out in different arenas. So Discipline and Punish is a book where he talks about hegemony in the prison system, and it's very readable. He starts with our earliest ideas about how we do discipline and punishment, things like being in the village square and you would tie a criminal to 4 horses and set them running, and the criminal would be torn apart. When someone was drawn and quartered, they were literally torn into 4 pieces. And it kind of takes you through this idea of like, in the early days, a lot of it was almost being scared straight, like we'll make it as horrific as possible to how we punish our criminals so that people will be scared out of committing crimes, right? And that evolves over time. He goes through like the medicalization of the prison system in the Victorian era, takes it all the way to where we are now. And it's just fascinating. And he sort of makes visible for you all of the structures that keep it going, so that now we're in a place where we have these private prisons, which are profit-making enterprises in America that make a lot of money for the people who own them. And we have entire towns that have sprung up around that prison that are supporting it, so that if you wanted to go in and shut the prison down, you also end up putting hundreds of people out of work, and now you have hundreds of families that need to move or otherwise find jobs, but there probably aren't enough jobs for them locally because the only reason the town was there was because of the prison system, right? And so that's the kind of sort of, it's almost like tentacles, right? Like hegemonic systems like send out lots and lots of little tentacles and weave themselves through society, so that it's almost impossible to reform them, to change them without tearing out a bunch of those tentacles, essentially. So connecting it all to literature, and I'll finish with this, I swear. I know this is a longer one, but hopefully me talking through this is going to be useful to you. So, there is, she talks about Lukács, Lukács, I'm not sure how that's supposed to be pronounced, and the Frankfurt School. And so he writes about realism. He thought modernism was stagnant, it denied historical realities and dynamic politics. Realism is capable of giving access to the reality of experience, and yet modernists make that same argument about their connection to reality. So, I don't know. Lukács would say it's only the realist text that strives towards a direct representation that can achieve such closeness to the real world. Modernism can never achieve that because its focus on individual experiences closes it off from taking the big picture events and their historical significance. I would probably personally disagree with this. I think, I'm a writer myself, and I think you can do a lot with different types of writing. You can do realist writing that supports current political structures. You can do realist writing that intervenes in it. You can do fantastical writing that does either or both. And I think this kind of connects back to the formalists, and I'm personally a little suspicious of this. The formalists tend to want to believe that form defines all kinds of stuff, and once you choose certain forms and structures, you're kind of locked in to only being able to do certain things with them. And I don't know that I think that's true. And give sort of one more example. So Bertolt Brecht, who's a terrific, brilliant playwright, his plays are awesome. They're very funny and absurd and fascinating. He was a Marxist, right? And he wanted to create drama that wouldn't let the audience be manipulated, right? He was worried with realist drama that audiences would get so drawn in they'd forget they were watching a play. Like, you're watching movies and so on, like they're often trying to immerse you, they're trying to put you there in that moment, right? By being lured into the fantasy, Brecht felt that audiences responded emotionally and lost the ability to engage with art as a social and political critique. I think that's a little, maybe unfair to the audience. It is not giving them enough credit for, I can be caught up in a TV show in the moment and very much immersed in it, feeling the emotions, etc. That doesn't mean I can't be sitting at dinner with my husband later talking about this and tear it apart and say like, wow, I was really kind of manipulated. I mean, to give you an example, Queen's Gambit, lots of people watched that over the holidays and people were really into it. And I enjoyed it while I was watching it and I was really caught up in it. But afterwards, I was really disturbed by the way in which it kept putting her in scenarios where it seemed like she was going to be under physical threat, maybe sexual assault threat, and then saving her. Like, none of those things happened. And I thought that's a pretty manipulative way to tell this story, because you're kind of like, here's a story about a woman in chess, and you're relying on people's fear that she's going to be sexually assaulted to get the audience engaged, right? So that's an example of like, when I was watching it, I was caught up in it. It worked on me, but afterwards I could think about it and take it apart a little. But Brecht was concerned about this, and so he developed in his work the alienation effect, where he would interrupt social realism with songs, stage direction shouted out on stage, obvious scenery changes, trying to prevent the audience from immersing themselves in the play, in the hope that this would lead them to think critically about the events being presented. So, and that actually can be a really useful technique, right? As a writer, or as a TV watcher or reader, I think it's really interesting when I'm sort of immersed in falling into something, and then the author, the actors kind of like break out and do something else. And I'm like, wait, what's going on? I'm thinking of something like Buffy the Musical, right? Like, suddenly we're in a musical. What? I thought I was just watching my vampire TV show. So, and it makes you question, and it gives you like another layer of things to think about. So it is a useful technique. I just don't think it's like the only way to do it. I wouldn't say that realism precludes audience ability to has the power to draw audiences away from the current state of events and lead them to question the status quo. This difficult experimental literature, the avant-garde, unsettles audiences. And the masses reject it because it forces them to confront their own oppression. For those who engage with it, it leads to political awakening. This is a lovely idea that I think is just wrong, right? I think the Frankfurt critics, they wanted to believe that experimental literature was kind of inherently more politically effective at creating change. And I don't think that's necessarily true. And in fact, an example of this, I would say, is there was this TV show, Will and Grace. You guys are young. I don't know whether you've seen it. But it's a show in which there's a couple of gay men, and one of them being Will, and his best friend, Grace, who is a straight woman. And it's a sitcom. It's a funny, light sitcom. And it is not groundbreaking in a experimental way. It follows sitcom formulas pretty rigidly, and it was very popular. It is pretty much an exemplar of popular art. However, it put a gay man, a couple of gay men, into the public consciousness in a non-threatening way. And I would say, as a result, I would argue that it contributed materially to us getting gay marriage in America as quickly as we did. Because when I was in college, I would have said, we're 30 years out, 40 years out from that. And it happened much faster. And I think it's because here's this fiction, this TV show, this literature that is very popular and has changed like one little thing, right? Other shows that do this kind of thing, or I would say Modern Family is trying to do the same kind of work, or Blackish, or, oh, I'm going to forget the name of the one with Rita Moreno. Now I've got to look it up. It's a recent sitcom, One Day at a Time. Great, great show. All of these are following very standard sitcom formulas in a lot of ways. They are clearly popular lit, but they are nonetheless contributing towards social change. So, including along economic lines, like One Day at a Time definitely is concerned with sort of like the financial difficulties of the family as a piece of that, and hopefully, I think we'll be trying to raise some awareness and lead people to ask, is this fair? Is there a better way to do things? Okay, so I hope all of that was helpful to you. It is, yeah, essentially this chapter is about bringing in economic consciousness to literature, asking if literature can be used to help affect social change, and then what kinds of literature are or are not effective at creating social change. Okay, that's it for now. Talk to you guys soon.